Well, welcome to this week's episode of Tuesdays with Thomas. Today we're going to talk about the man who was the greatest philosophical influence on Thomas, the man that Thomas simply refers to as the philosopher. I'm speaking, of course, of Aristotle. Now, it is true that Thomas had many great influences in his thinking. You can see from this famous painting, Plato is on his left and Aristotle is on his right. And some poor opponent of his is at his feet. We won't talk about him right now. But certainly the greatest influence on his life was Aristotle. In this video, what I'll talk about is the thought world of ancient Greek philosophy and some of the ideas of Aristotle that you'll see reflected in the writings of Thomas Aquinas. So the ancient Greek philosophers were focused on the issue of the unity and diversity of our experience. I went on Google and I did a search for ancient chairs. So you can see here a picture of a chair from ancient Egypt, one from ancient China, and one from ancient Rome. And yet, while these chairs all come from different countries, even different continents, and while they're from a vastly different time than our own, we can recognize them as chairs. So while these chairs are all different from each other, they are at the same time same in a certain respect. There is a similarity in quality to them. There is a similar concept of chair that they all share, even though they all have differences among them. It's this unity and diversity, or sometimes it's called the problem of the one and the many, that ancient Greek philosophers were focused on. Now, Plato and Aristotle had two very different approaches to how we should try to understand the world and its unity and its diversity. And their two different approaches are reflected in this very famous painting by Raphael. Here's an excerpt of it, his painting of the school at Athens. And you can see Plato here on the left with his finger pointed up. He's pointing to the heavens. And what that symbolizes is Plato's belief that we must start with the world of ideas and concepts, the world of the intellect, that the senses, the things that we can sense empirically can be so deceptive. So we must begin with the world of ideas and apply those to the material world in order to gain knowledge of what we see and observe. On the other hand, his famous student Aristotle, whose hand is motioning downward, said, no, we must actually begin with our observations of the material world and then abstract from those our ideas and our concepts. Now, of course, I'm painting with a very broad brush, but these two basic approaches, which you could call rationalism and empiricism. Rationalism, the idea that we begin with the mind, and empiricism, the idea that we begin with our experience, are really the two broad schools of thought that have debated philosophy through the centuries of critical thinking about issues. Now, Thomas Aquinas was influenced by both Plato and Aristotle, but definitely on this issue, he was Aristotelian in his thinking. He was an empiricist, though his form of empiricism was much different than the kind of empiricism which drives a lot of philosophy in the modern age. And I'll explain why more here in just a second. Now, there's a second and related issue, aside from just the broad unity and diversity of the world, that ancient philosophers dealt with. One of the reasons there is so much variety in the world is because of change. How does change take place? To understand Aristotle's answer to this question, it's helpful to understand the answer of one of his philosophical predecessors, whose name was Parmenides. Parmenides said, things don't change. Now, I know that sounds crazy, but Parmenides actually had a pretty good argument, an argument that I think everybody would agree with, at least in terms of its first premise. Parmenides said, look, from nothing, nothing comes. You can't get something from nothing. So then consider this ice cube. It's a solid. So with regard to the state of being a liquid, what we have here is nothing. There's no liquid here. There's just a solid. There's no thing here with regard to liquidity. Now, it may heat up outside and you may observe what you think is a change taking place. This ice cube melts and becomes a liquid. But remember, you can't get something from nothing. You can't get liquid from no liquid. You can't get some liquid from no liquid. You can't get something from nothing. And so, I guess what Parmenides would say is, even though it looks like something has changed here, since you can't get something from nothing, who are you going to believe? Me or your lying eyes? Well, Aristotle, the eminent philosopher of common sense, knew that there was something wrong with this argument. But what philosophers do is they provide rigorous argumentation to explain what we all take for granted as common sense. And here's what Aristotle said in response to the argument of Parmenides. What he said is that Parmenides is guilty of making a false choice here. The issue with regard to this ice cube and liquidity is not simply a matter of there being something or nothing. What Aristotle said is that while it is true that this ice cube is actually a solid, it is also at the same time potentially a liquid. Now, the ice cube is not potentially just anything it wants to be. It's not potentially a daffodil. It's not potentially a zebra. It's not potentially a tree. But it is potentially a liquid. And so what has happened in order for this solid to become a liquid is that something has caused the potential of its liquidity to become actual. And all that means is then that the liquid state isn't coming from nothing. The liquid state is coming from its potential. The potential to be a liquid has been made actual. And so that's how Aristotle defined what change actually is. Change is simply when something's potential has been made actual. But the potential had always existed. The ice cube doesn't become a zebra, doesn't become a daffodil. It never had those potentials. But it did have the potential to become a liquid, and that potential was made actual. So then when you come to the writings of Thomas Aquinas and you see a statement like this, for motion, when by that he means change, is nothing else than the reduction of something from potentiality to actuality. All he's saying is what Aristotle just said, which is namely, what change is when you take something from all of its full range of possibilities or capabilities or potentialities, and you reduce those down to one state of actuality. So the ice cube had many possible states. You reduce it down to the actual state of becoming a liquid. Now then, there's a third issue I want to talk about that's very important when you get to the writings of Thomas Aquinas. And that is, why do things exist? So let's go back to a picture of one of these chairs I showed you earlier. Why does this chair exist? Well, of course, our first answer to that question would be to say, well, there was a chair maker. Somebody assembled this chair. And then a second answer we would give is, well, this chair exists because there is the wood and there is the wicker or whatever that is that makes the chair that's been assembled together. And a third because we would give, I suppose, is we would say this chair exists because the chair maker had some kind of pattern. Maybe he had drawn it out. Maybe he had just in his head a pattern. And of course, remember, I showed you pictures of various chairs. Aside from the pattern of this particular chair that he made, he also had a larger concept or idea of just chairs in general. And then finally, we might say this chair was made because somebody wants to sit down. And so maybe the chair maker was given an order, hey, make me a chair so I can sit down in it. Now, these four answers, these four becauses, are the famous four causes of Aristotle. Here's the technical jargon that goes with each of these answers. First of all, the chair maker would represent the efficient cause, the person who effects or makes the chair. And secondly, the wood and the wicker represents the materials that were made, that the chair was made from. And so they are said to be the material cause of the chair. And then third, the concept, the idea of the chair is what's called its formal cause. I mean, wood and wicker could be made anything. It could be made into a desk, it could be made into a basket, but it was configured here to be made a chair. Don't confuse the idea of form with a shape, because remember, there were many different shapes of chairs. It's a broader term than that. It's a conceptual configuration is what we're talking about here. And then the reason the chair was made was so somebody could sit down. And so in the jargon of Aristotle, that's called the final cause. Now what's interesting is, even though the purpose of the chair is called the final cause, actually really that has the priority over all of these causes. It comes first. What do I mean by that? Well, because you know that the purpose of this chair is for someone to sit in it, That determines the configuration of the materials. It has to be configured in a way for someone to be able to sit into it. It determines what kind of materials will be used. You're not going to use paper. You're going to use wood and wicker. And quite honestly, I'm not sure I would want to sit in that chair just based on how I'm configured. And then it's going to determine how the efficient cause, how the maker assembles everything together so that it's suitable for someone to sit in. So the final cause actually determines everything else. Now, these four causes are easiest to see in things that people make, but they are also evident in nature itself. If you look at this diagram of a heart, the efficient cause of the heart, you might say, is the DNA, which gives the instructions for the assemblage of the material. The material would be the various muscle fibers and nerve tissue, the veins and arteries that comprise the heart. The formal cause would be the configuration that makes all of those muscles and fibers and nerves and tissues a heart as opposed to a lung or pancreas. And the final cause, or the purpose of the heart, is to pump blood. And because that's its final purpose, that's why the heart has this configuration as opposed to the configuration of the brain. That's why it has these materials as opposed to the materials of the foot. That's why DNA gave it these instructions as opposed to the instructions given to the eye. Now, although these are, to me, self-evident, and I would hope pretty commonsensical to you, the reality is that modern philosophy, from the time of Isaac Newton and Descartes, for example, have pretty much eliminated the concepts of formal and final causality. And virtually every mistake that has been made in philosophy since then has been made because of this. In fact, philosopher Edward Feser, in his book, The Last Superstition, says this: abandoning Aristotelianism, as the founders of modern philosophy did, was the single greatest mistake ever made in the entire history of Western thought. And I think you're going to see as we study more about Thomas Aquinas, it's hard to argue with that. Now, one final thing I want to say before we conclude today in this survey of the thought of Aristotle. Why study Aristotle? Why did Thomas want to learn from him and take the best of what he had to say? And as far as that goes, why are we going to study Thomas Aquinas? One of his writings, Thomas says this: the study of philosophy is not for the sake of knowing what men thought, but what the truth of things is. And if Aristotle could help him come to understand the truth of things as it actually is, Aquinas was glad to learn from him. One of the great illustrations of this principle is that when the Israelites came out of Egypt, they took the plunder of the pagan Egyptians and turned it into something beautiful in the tabernacle for God's use. What Aquinas wanted to do was to take the plunder of pagan philosophy, take what was good and beautiful and true from it, and then turn it into something for the glory of God. And I hope to be able to do the same in our study of Thomas Aquinas.